objects we carry believing they protect us. Small talismans we embrace as if they were capable of stopping forces we don't even understand. Marcus Thompson had found his in an old antique shop in Salem, Massachusetts, hidden among dusty relics and forgotten stories. The silver amulet gleamed with symbols he couldn't decipher, but something in his torn soul whispered that this could be his salvation. The curse had reached him like a tainted inheritance, passed down through generations of Thompson men who carried the same dark burden. His grandfather had died under mysterious circumstances during a full moon night, found in the woods with wounds that doctors could never adequately explain. His father had disappeared when Marcus turned 16, leaving only blood trails that led to the forest depths and an enigmatic letter talking about a family curse that couldn't be broken, only contained. Marcus had tried to ignore the signs for years, attributing the recurring nightmares to stress and the subtle transformations he noticed in his body to the effects of his disturbed imagination. But when he turned 32, reality imposed itself with a brutality that could no longer be denied. The first transformations came like waves of pain that seemed to tear his soul in half, leaving him conscious of the horror unfolding in his own body. The amulet represented his last hope of maintaining some control over the beast growing inside him. He wore it constantly, feeling the cold metal against his skin as a constant reminder of his fight against something that transcended his human understanding. For weeks, the object seemed to work, keeping the transformations at a level he could bear, allowing him to maintain his human appearance even when the moon began to grow in the night sky. But the nature of the curse was more complex and insidious than Marcus had imagined. The amulet didn't eliminate the monster. It just compressed it, creating an internal pressure that grew with each lunar cycle. Each night that passed, Marcus felt the hunger intensifying, not just for flesh, but for something more primitive and terrible. It was a need that transcended the physical, a thirst for violence and destruction that grew like an infection in his mind, fed by the very resistance he offered. The nights became an internal battlefield where Marcus fought against impulses that became more powerful with each rising moon. He began avoiding public places, fearing that his growing agitation would be noticed by others. His eyes, once a warm brown, began reflecting a yellowish light in moments of greatest tension, and his hands developed a strength he couldn't completely control. The amulet burned against his skin during these crises, as if it were fighting against a force that was growing beyond its capacity for containment. The physical transformation was just the superficial reflection of a much deeper and more disturbing change. Marcus realized that his personality was being corroded by something primitive and wild that recognized no moral or social limits. During the day, when lunar influence was weaker, he could maintain an appearance of normalcy, but he knew he was living an increasingly fragile lie. His co-workers at the accounting office began noticing his growing irritability and the moments of mental absence that became more frequent. The amulet had become both his salvation and his prison. He didn't dare remove it even to sleep, fearing that the beast would emerge completely without the mystical barrier the object provided. But the forced containment was taking a terrible toll on his sanity. Marcus began having visions during the day, fragments of memories that didn't belong to him, echoes of ancestral hunts that seemed to pulse through the amulet directly into his mind. These visions brought with them a dark satisfaction that deeply disturbed him, a part of him that longed for the freedom that complete transformation could offer. The waxing moon brought with it an intensity Marcus had never experienced before. The amulet, which for weeks had been his shield against the curse, began heating against his skin in a way that transcended physical discomfort. It was as if the metal were being forged anew each night, molded by the growing pressure of the beast that struggled in its mystical prison. Marcus found he could no longer concentrate on simple tasks. His mind was constantly divided between human consciousness and something much more primitive that observed the world through his eyes with growing hunger. During his work hours, Marcus began noticing details that had previously gone unnoticed. The smell of his co-workers had become more intense and specific, each person carrying a unique aroma that awakened instinctive reactions in his altered mind. Sarah, the secretary who worked at the desk next to his, emanated a floral perfume that mixed with something more subtle and disturbing, the smell of fear. She had begun avoiding eye contact with him, her basic human instincts alerting her to a threat she couldn't consciously identify. The hunger growing inside Marcus wasn't just for ordinary food. It was something deeper and more terrifying, a need that his human side refused to fully acknowledge. He began dreaming of nocturnal hunts, chases through dark forests where he ran with a speed and agility that transcended human limitations. In these dreams, the satisfaction of capture was intense and visceral, providing a pleasure that deeply disturbed him when he woke. The amulet began showing signs of physical stress. Small cracks appeared in the ancient silver, as if the metal were being tested beyond its limits. Marcus noticed that these fissures widened slightly each night, accompanying the moon's growth in the sky. He tried to ignore the obvious symbolism, but a growing part of his mind knew that the amulet couldn't contain the curse indefinitely. The question wasn't whether the object would fail, but when it would happen. The changes in his appearance became more pronounced and difficult to hide. His canines seemed sharper, and he developed the unconscious habit of running his tongue over them during conversations. His colleagues began making comments about his eyes, noticing how they seemed to glow strangely under certain lights. Marcus invested in dark sunglasses that he wore even indoors, claiming light sensitivity, but he knew he was just postponing the inevitable. The psychological pressure of forced containment began manifesting in increasingly disturbing ways. Marcus developed nervous tics, mainly the habit of unconsciously scratching his own skin until it bled. His nails had grown more quickly and become naturally sharper, leaving marks he had difficulty explaining. During work meetings, he caught himself observing his colleagues' necks, imagining the pulse of the carotid artery with a clarity that terrified him. The first significant crack in the amulet appeared on a night when the moon was almost full, radiating a silver light that seemed to penetrate through the closed curtains of his apartment. Marcus woke with a stabbing pain in his chest, as if something were trying to tear his heart in half. The amulet was too hot to touch, pulsing against his skin with a rhythm that didn't match his human heartbeat. When he managed to get up and look in the mirror, he saw that the main crack had extended across almost half the object, revealing a dark interior that seemed to absorb the light around it. That same night, Marcus experienced his first partial transformation since he'd begun wearing the amulet. His bones lengthened painfully, mainly in his arms and legs, forcing him to bend into a posture that was neither completely human nor totally bestial. His face began to deform, his nose and mouth projecting to form a primitive snout, while sharp fangs emerged from his gums with a pain that made him scream in silent agony. His dark hair, normally well-combed, became wild and coarse, growing in irregular patches that covered parts of his face and neck. The transformation wasn't complete, leaving Marcus trapped in a hybrid form that was more terrible than any nightmare he'd ever experienced. He maintained his human eyes, but they now reflected a pain and rage that transcended any emotion he'd ever felt. His favorite orange shirt tore under the pressure of his expanded muscles, hanging in tatters from his torso that had become broader and more muscular. One hand had transformed completely, developing sharp claws he couldn't control, while the other remained partially human, allowing him to still grasp objects with relative precision. During this partial transformation, Marcus discovered that his mind wasn't completely lost to the beast. He remained conscious, able to think and reason, but his thoughts were being constantly invaded by primitive impulses that demanded immediate satisfaction. The hunger he felt was no longer just for flesh, but for violence, for domination, for something his human side refused to name. He found himself growling involuntarily, emitting sounds that seemed to spring from the depths of his transformed throat. The amulet continued burning against his skin, but its effectiveness was clearly diminishing. Marcus realized he was fighting a losing battle, maintaining himself in a form that satisfied neither his humanity nor his bestial nature. The forced containment was creating unbearable tension that threatened to destroy not just the amulet, but his own sanity. He began questioning whether complete transformation wouldn't be, in fact, a relief compared to the constant agony of existing between two worlds. The experience left Marcus physically exhausted, but mentally more alert to the dangers he faced. He knew the amulet was failing and that he needed to find a solution before completely losing control. But a growing and disturbing part of his mind whispered that perhaps control was an illusion he'd never really possessed. Maybe the curse wasn't something to be contained, but something to be accepted as an integral part of his nature. During the following days, Marcus tried researching alternatives to the failing amulet. He visited old libraries, consulted books on supernatural folklore, and even tried contacting occult specialists. But every source he consulted only confirmed his worst fears. A curse transmitted through generations could rarely be broken, only transferred or accepted. The amulet had provided temporary containment, but had never been intended as a permanent solution. The most disturbing discovery came through an ancient manuscript Marcus found in a private library in Boston. The document, written in archaic Latin with English translations in the margins, revealed that amulets like his weren't tools of containment, but of concentration. They didn't suppress the curse. They refined it, intensified it until it became impossible to contain. What Marcus had believed to be his salvation was actually a catalyst that was preparing his final transformation to be more powerful and uncontrollable than it ever could have been naturally. The manuscript described cases similar to his, cursed men who had used mystical objects attempting to control their bestial nature. All the accounts ended the same way, in an explosion of violence that devastated not just the curse bearer, but everyone around them. The amulet didn't eliminate hunger, it accumulated it, compressing it until it became a destructive force capable of annihilating any vestige of humanity remaining in the host. Marcus realized with growing horror that each day he kept the amulet was another day feeding the beast growing inside him. The visions he experienced weren't echoes of the past, but glimpses of the future the amulet was shaping for him. He saw himself hunting through his city's streets, pursuing human prey with an efficiency and brutality that transcended anything a common werewolf could achieve. The amulet was creating a perfect predator, and Marcus was just the vessel being prepared to house this abomination. The awareness of this truth brought with it a fundamental change in Marcus's perspective on his situation. He began considering the possibility of removing the amulet before it was too late, allowing the transformation to occur naturally before the accumulated pressure became explosive. But this consideration brought its own terrors. Without the amulet, he would immediately lose any control he still possessed, transforming into a creature that would recognize no moral limits or human connections. During one particularly difficult night, Marcus experienced another partial transformation, but this time more intense and lasting. His body had gradually grown accustomed to the changes, allowing him to maintain the hybrid form for hours at a time. He observed himself in the mirror, seeing how his appearance had become a disturbing mixture of man and beast. His orange shirt, now permanently torn, hung from his broad shoulders like a reminder of his lost humanity. His human eyes, filled with pain and rage, observed a face that was becoming increasingly unfamiliar. In this form, Marcus discovered he could think with terrible clarity. There was no mental confusion or loss of control. He was fully aware of every violent impulse that arose in his transformed mind. This was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of his condition. He wasn't losing his humanity in a fog of animal instinct, but was consciously watching as it was replaced by something much more sinister and calculated. The hunger had evolved beyond the physical, becoming a psychological need for domination and destruction. Marcus caught himself planning attacks with a precision that horrified him, identifying weak points in his neighborhood and routines of people he regularly encountered. His human mind screamed in protest against these thoughts, but a growing part of him found satisfaction in the planning, as if he were finally preparing to fulfill a purpose that had always been latent in his nature. The amulet now showed multiple cracks, spreading like a web across its silver surface. Marcus knew its complete failure was a matter of days, perhaps hours. He faced an impossible choice: remove the amulet voluntarily and face immediate transformation, or await its natural failure and face something much worse. An explosion of concentrated violence that could devastate everything around him. The full moon approached with an inevitability that weighed on Marcus like a death sentence. He could feel its influence growing even during the day, pulling something primitive and hungry from the depths of his soul. The amulet had become almost unbearably hot, burning his skin with an intensity that left red marks around his neck. The cracks now extended across its entire surface, and Marcus could hear a subtle but disturbing sound, a low, constant moan that seemed to spring from the metal itself, as if the object were suffering under pressure that exceeded its physical limits. During his last week of work, Marcus became a disturbing presence in the office. His colleagues began openly avoiding him, their primitive instincts alerting them to a danger they couldn't rationally identify. Sarah, the secretary, requested a transfer to another department after an incident where Marcus involuntarily growled during a meeting. He'd tried to disguise the sound as throat clearing, but everyone in the room had felt something fundamentally wrong about that guttural noise that seemed to spring from a throat that wasn't completely human. The partial transformations became more frequent and less predictable. Marcus discovered he no longer needed the full moon to trigger the changes. Any moment of stress or intense anger was enough to initiate the process. During a traffic jam, he felt his bones begin to lengthen and his teeth sharpen when another driver honked impatiently behind him. He managed to control the transformation only by concentrating all his willpower on the amulet. But he knew he was rapidly losing his ability to maintain any control over the process. The hunger had become a constant companion, whispering in his mind throughout day and night. It was no longer just a desire for flesh, but a complex and disturbing need that included violence, domination, and something even more sinister that Marcus refused to examine completely. He began dreaming of specific hunts, pursuing people he knew through the familiar streets of his city. In these dreams, the satisfaction of capture was intense and visceral, providing a pleasure that left him physically aroused when he woke, a reaction that filled him with disgust and terror. Marcus tried to isolate himself completely, calling in sick to work and avoiding any social contact. But isolation only intensified his obsession with the impending transformation. He spent hours observing himself in the mirror, studying the subtle changes occurring in his face and body, even when not transformed. His canines had become visibly longer, and he'd developed the habit of keeping them hidden during conversations. His nails grew with unnatural speed, requiring daily cuts that left their tips too sharp to be completely human. On the night before the full moon, Marcus made a decision he knew was irreversible. He could no longer bear the agony of containment, nor could he allow the amulet to fail naturally and release a force that could devastate innocent people. He chose an isolated location in the woods outside the city, the same type of forest where his father had disappeared years before. It was a place where transformation could occur without threatening others, a location where he could face his true nature away from human eyes. As he walked through the dark trees, Marcus felt the amulet pulsing against his chest with growing intensity. The cracks now emitted a faint, sinister light, as if something were trying to escape from within the metal. He knew he was carrying a mystical bomb that could explode at any moment, releasing not just his own curse, but decades of accumulated energy that had been compressed by the mystical object. When he reached an isolated clearing, Marcus stopped and placed his hand over the amulet. He could feel the intense heat radiating through his palms, burning his skin with a pain that was almost pleasurable in its intensity. This would be the moment of his final choice: remove the amulet and accept his transformation, or allow it to fail naturally and face the unknown consequences of a curse that had been artificially intensified beyond its natural limits. The full moon emerged through the treetops, like a silver eye observing the drama about to unfold. Marcus felt its influence as a physical force pressing against his skin, awakening every cell in his body to the transformation that had been postponed for so long. The amulet responded to the lunar presence with an intensity that made him scream in pain, the metal now so hot it began burning through his shirt, leaving a red and bright mark on his skin. In that moment of supreme agony, Marcus realized the choice had already been made for him. The amulet wouldn't wait for his decision. It was failing under the combined pressure of the full moon and the concentrated curse it had accumulated for weeks. The cracks expanded rapidly, and a sound like breaking glass echoed through the silent forest. Fragments of ancient silver flew in all directions, carrying with them sparks of mystical energy that illuminated the clearing with supernatural light. The transformation that followed was different from anything Marcus had experienced before. It wasn't the gradual, painful process he knew, but an explosion of change that reformed his body in a matter of seconds. His bones lengthened and thickened with a speed that should have been impossible, while his muscles expanded to accommodate his new skeletal structure. His face deformed rapidly, his nose and mouth projecting to form the snout that had appeared only partially in his previous transformations. But this time, Marcus kept his human consciousness intact, observing through eyes that remained fundamentally human while his body became something completely different. His dark hair, combed back in his human form, became wild and coarse, growing in irregular patches that covered parts of his face and neck. His orange shirt tore completely under the pressure of his muscular torso, hanging in tatters that moved with his powerful movements. One of his hands had transformed completely, developing sharp claws that reflected the moonlight like polished blades. The other remained partially human, allowing him to still grasp objects, but with a strength that could crush bones effortlessly. He growled involuntarily, the sound echoing through the forest with an intensity that made small animals flee in terror. But behind that growl was something even more disturbing, the consciousness of a man observing his own transformation into a monster. The hunger that had grown inside him for weeks finally found its complete expression. It was no longer a suppressed desire, but an urgent and immediate need that dominated every thought. Marcus could smell life for miles around, perceiving the presence of other creatures in the forest with a precision that transcended human senses. But even more disturbing was how he could sense the presence of humans in the distant city, their hearts beating like drums calling for his attention. The release from forced containment brought with it a terrible euphoria. Marcus had spent weeks fighting against his nature, trying to suppress impulses he now realized were a fundamental part of who he really was. The transformation wasn't a curse to be fought, but an awakening to a truth he denied his entire life. He was a predator, created to hunt, and the attempt to deny this nature had been the true source of his suffering. As he stood in the clearing, observing the fragments of the destroyed amulet glowing on the forest floor, Marcus realized his journey was just beginning. The amulet had failed to contain him, but it had also failed to define him. He still possessed his human consciousness, could still choose how to use the power that now flowed through his transformed body. The question haunting him was no longer how to control the beast, but what to do with the terrible freedom that complete transformation had given him. The moon continued shining above him, indifferent to the choices he faced. In the forest shadows, Marcus could hear the sounds of nocturnal life. Small creatures that didn't know a new predator had emerged in their territory. And far beyond the forest, the city lights flickered like terrestrial stars, each representing a life now within reach of his sharp claws. The true test of his humanity wouldn't be his ability to control the beast, but his choices about how to use the power it had given him.